Robert Martinez adjusted his worn military cap one last time before stepping out his pickup truck. The faded green fabric had seen better days, just like Robert himself. At 62 years old, his hands shook slightly from the nerve damage he'd sustained during his third tour in Afghanistan. The cap wasn't just an accessory to him. It was a symbol of 25 years of service, 3 Purple Hearts, and memories of brothers who never made it home. The courthouse steps seemed steeper than they should have been. Robert's left leg, rebuilt with metal pins and screws after an IED explosion, protested with each step. He was here for what should have been a simple traffic violation hearing. 3 weeks ago, he'd been pulled over for a broken taillight he couldn't afford to fix immediately. His disability pension barely covered his medications and rent for the small apartment he shared with his aging German Shepherd, Rex. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning hit him like a cold slap. The building buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurrying between courtrooms, families gathered on wooden benches whispering nervously, and court officers directing traffic with practiced efficiency. Robert found a seat in the back of courtroom 3B and waited for his name to be called. Officer David Brooks stood near the front of the courtroom, his uniform crisp and his posture rigid. At 34, Brooks had been with the police force for 8 years. He prided himself on following protocol to the letter. When he noticed the older man in the back wearing a military cap indoors, his jaw tightened. Rules were rules, regardless of who you were or what you'd done. In his mind, showing proper respect for the court meant removing all headwear, no exceptions. As the morning progressed, Robert watched case after case being called. He noticed how some people seemed to know exactly what to do, while others looked as lost as he felt. When a young mother struggled to quiet her crying baby, Robert caught her eye and offered a gentle smile. He remembered his own daughter at that age, before the divorce, before the long deployments that slowly eroded his marriage. Sarah was in college now, and they barely spoke twice a year. Judge Patricia Williams had been presiding over this courtroom for 15 years. At 58, she'd seen every type of case imaginable and had developed a keen sense for reading people. She noticed the veteran in the back row immediately, not because of his cap, but because of the way he carried himself. There was something unmistakably military in his bearing, even as he sat quietly waiting his turn. The morning session was running long. A domestic dispute case had taken nearly an hour to resolve, and the judge could see the frustration building in the waiting room. She called for a 15-minute recess, during which Officer Brooks approached the bench. He pointed toward Robert and spoke in low tones about courthouse protocol and proper decorum. Robert remained seated during the recess, unaware of the conversation taking place at the front of the room. He was thinking about Rex, who would need his afternoon medication soon. The old dog had been his constant companion since returning from his final deployment. Rex had been a military working dog too, and they understood each other in ways that didn't require words. Both had scars that weren't visible to the naked eye. When court resumed, the atmosphere felt different. Officer Brooks positioned himself with a clear view of Robert, his hand resting on his radio. Judge Williams resumed her place behind the bench, but her expression had grown more serious. She glanced toward the back of the room several times as she worked through the remaining cases. The clock on the wall read 2:30 p.m. when the clerk finally called Robert Martinez, case number 47821. Robert stood slowly, his leg protesting after sitting for so long, and made his way down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. As he walked, he was completely unaware that his simple appearance was about to trigger a confrontation that would change everyone in that room. Officer Brooks stepped forward as Robert approached the defendant's table. His voice carried clearly across the courtroom as he called out, "Sir, you need to remove your hat in the courtroom. It's disrespectful to the court." Robert stopped mid-stride, confusion washing over his weathered face. He hadn't realized he was still wearing his cap. In the military, removing your cover indoors was automatic, but civilian life had blurred some of those lines for him. His hand instinctively moved toward his cap, but something in the officer's tone made him pause. It wasn't just a polite reminder. There was an edge to it that felt unnecessarily harsh. "I'm sorry, officer," Robert replied quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of shouting orders over helicopter rotors and gunfire. I didn't mean any disrespect. His fingers found the bill of his cap, preparing to remove it, but Officer Brooks wasn't finished. Military service doesn't give you special privileges in my courtroom, Brooks continued, his voice rising slightly. Everyone follows the same rules here. Remove it now. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He'd heard similar sentiments before, usually from people who had never served, who didn't understand that respect and protocol were concepts he'd literally bled for. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his cap, not from fear, but from a mixture of hurt and anger that he fought to control. Judge Williams had been watching the interaction with growing concern. She could see the pain flash across the veteran's face at Officer Brooks's words. Something about the whole situation felt wrong to her. The man hadn't been defiant or disrespectful. He'd simply forgotten to remove his cap. Brooks's reaction seemed disproportionate to the situation. Other people in the courtroom began to take notice. An elderly woman in the front row turned to get a better look at what was happening. A young lawyer, gathering his papers, paused to observe. The tension in the room was becoming palpable, and Judge Williams knew she needed to intervene before the situation escalated further. Robert finally grasped his cap with both hands, but before he could remove it, Judge Williams spoke up. "Officer Brooks, please step back." Her voice carried the authority of 15 years on the bench, and there was something in her tone that made everyone in the courtroom stop what they were doing. Brooks turned toward the judge, surprise evident on his face. He'd been following protocol as he understood it. In his 8 years of courthouse duty, he'd asked dozens of people to remove hats, caps, and other headwear. This should have been no different. "Your Honor, courthouse policy clearly states, I'm aware of our policies, Officer Brooks," Judge Williams interrupted, her gaze shifting between the officer and Robert, who still stood frozen with his hands on his cap. "Mr. Martinez, please approach the bench." Robert walked the remaining few steps to stand before the judge's elevated platform. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, and the familiar weight of unwanted attention settled on his shoulders. Throughout his military career, he'd received numerous commendations and medals, but he'd never been comfortable with public recognition. He preferred to serve quietly and let others take the spotlight. As Robert stood before her bench, Judge Williams took a moment to really look at him. She noticed the slight favor of his left leg, the careful way he held his shoulders to compensate for old injuries, and, most importantly, the dignity with which he carried himself despite the uncomfortable situation. There was something about his bearing that reminded her of her own father, who had served in Vietnam and rarely spoke about his experiences. "Mr. Martinez," the judge said gently, "before we address your case, I'd like to know about your service. What branch of the military were you in?" Robert's posture straightened automatically. "United States Army, Your Honor." "Infantry. I served for 25 years before medical retirement." He paused, then added 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Officer Brooks, who had been preparing to argue his position further, found himself paying closer attention. The weight of Robert's service record hung in the air like a challenge to anyone who might question his character or dedication to his country. Judge Williams nodded slowly, processing what she'd heard. 25 years of service meant this man had dedicated the majority of his adult life to protecting others. 3 Purple Hearts suggested he'd been wounded multiple times in service to his country. The medical retirement likely meant his injuries were serious enough to end his career, not his choice to leave. "And the cap you're wearing," Judge Williams continued, "does it have special significance to you?" Robert's weathered hands tightened slightly on the cap he still held. "Yes, Your Honor. It belonged to my unit in Afghanistan. I wore it during my final deployment. It's all I have left of some good men who didn't make a home." The silence in the courtroom deepened. Officer Brooks shifted uncomfortably, beginning to realize that he might have misread the situation entirely. Judge Williams felt her throat tighten as she absorbed Robert's words. The cap wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a memorial, a connection to fallen comrades, a tangible link to sacrifices that most people couldn't begin to comprehend. She glanced around the courtroom and saw that others were equally moved by his simple explanation. Officer Brooks stood motionless, his earlier confidence evaporating. His own grandfather had served in Korea, but had died when Brooks was young, before he could share his stories. Brooks had grown up hearing secondhand accounts of his grandfather's bravery, but he'd never had a direct connection to military service. Suddenly, his insistence on protocol felt petty and small. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams continued, her voice softer now, "I want you to know that your service to this country is not forgotten or unappreciated, at least not in this courtroom. Before we proceed with your case, I'd like to ask you about your time in Afghanistan. What did you do there?" Robert shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but respectful of the judge's question. "I was a squad leader, Your Honor. My job was to keep my men alive and complete our missions. We did convoy security, base protection, and worked with local Afghan forces to train them." He paused, his eyes distant. "Lost 3 men from my squad over those deployments. Good soldiers, better men than most people will ever meet." The elderly woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She recognized something in Robert's voice, the same hollow note she'd heard in her own husband's voice when he occasionally spoke about his time in Vietnam. Her Henry had carried that weight for 40 years before cancer took him, and she knew that some wounds never fully healed. Young lawyer Michael Chun, who had been preparing for his next case, found himself completely absorbed in Robert's story. Chin's own father had immigrated to America with nothing, and had always taught him that freedom wasn't free. Someone had to pay the price. Looking at Robert, he was seeing that price made manifest in scars both visible and hidden. Judge Williams made a decision that surprised everyone in the courtroom, including herself. She stood up from her chair, a gesture that immediately commanded everyone's complete attention. In 15 years on the bench, no one could remember her standing during proceedings except when entering or leaving the courtroom. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice carrying throughout the now silent room, "I want to tell you something that I should have said the moment you walked into my courtroom. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for the sacrifice of the men who didn't come home with you." Robert's hands trembled as he held his cap. He hadn't expected this. He'd come to court prepared to pay a fine for a broken taillight, not to relive memories of Afghanistan or discuss the loss of his battle brothers. Tears threatened at the corners of his eyes, but he fought them back with the same discipline that had carried him through 25 years of military service. The judge continued. "Officer Brooks was following what he believed to be proper protocol, but I think this situation called for something more than rigid adherence to rules. Mr. Martinez, I would consider it an honor if you would put your cap back on." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Officer Brooks's mouth opened slightly in surprise. This was unprecedented in his experience, and he wasn't sure how to respond. The courthouse policy regarding headwear was clear, but Judge Williams was obviously making an exception based on circumstances he hadn't fully considered. Robert looked up at Judge Williams with confusion and gratitude warring in his expression. "Your Honor, I don't want to cause any problems or break any rules. I can keep it off if that's what's required." "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams replied firmly, "sometimes honoring the spirit of respect is more important than following the letter of the law. Your cap represents service, sacrifice, and remembrance. Those are things this courtroom and this country should honor, not suppress." She gestured toward his hands. "Please put it back on." With careful, reverent movements, Robert placed the faded military cap back on his head. As he did, something shifted in the atmosphere of the courtroom. It wasn't just about a piece of headwear anymore. It was about recognition, respect, and the proper way to honor those who serve. Officer Brooks watched this exchange with growing understanding. His rigid interpretation of the rules hadn't accounted for the human element, for the stories and sacrifices that people carried with them. He began to see that true respect sometimes required flexibility and compassion, not just blind adherence to policy. Judge Williams wasn't finished. She had one more gesture to make, one that would turn this moment from a simple exception to courthouse policy into something that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Judge Williams reached beneath her bench and retrieved something that no one in the courtroom had expected to see. In her hand was a small American flag, the kind typically displayed on government desks. But this flag was different. It was worn and faded, clearly having seen significant use. She held it carefully, as if it were made of the most precious material on earth. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice now thick with emotion, "this flag was given to me by my father when I was sworn in as a judge 15 years ago. He carried it with him during his tour in Vietnam, through some of the darkest days of that conflict. He told me to display it as a reminder that justice and freedom are connected, that the rights we protect in this courtroom were purchased with blood by men like him, and like you." Robert stood transfixed, watching as Judge Williams stepped down from her elevated platform for the first time in anyone's memory during active court proceedings. She walked around the front of her bench, flag in hand, until she stood directly in front of him. The courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed as loud as thunder. "I want to present this to you," she continued, "not as a judge to a defendant, but as one American to another, in recognition of your service and the service of those who didn't come home." She extended the flag toward Robert with both hands. Robert's eyes filled with tears he could no longer contain. In 25 years of military service, he'd received numerous awards and commendations, but none had touched him like this simple gesture from a civilian judge who understood what his service meant. With shaking hands, he accepted the flag, holding it against his chest as if it might help heal wounds that had never properly closed. Officer Brooks watched this exchange with growing shame and admiration. Shame for his earlier treatment of Robert, and admiration for Judge Williams's courage in stepping outside normal protocol to do what was right. He realized that he'd been so focused on enforcing rules that he'd lost sight of the people those rules were meant to serve. His grandfather would have been disappointed in his behavior, and that knowledge cut deep. Without being asked or prompted, Officer Brooks stepped forward. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke, but in the absolute silence of the courtroom, everyone heard him clearly. "Mr. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Your service, what you've done for this country, I should have recognized that immediately." Robert turned to face the young officer, seeing not hostility now, but genuine remorse and respect. "Officer Brooks, you are doing your job. I understand that. We all have duties to perform." His voice was gentle, without a trace of anger or resentment. But Brooks wasn't finished. He stood at attention, brought his right hand to his forehead in a crisp salute, and held it while he spoke. "Sergeant Martinez, thank you for your service to this country and your sacrifice. It's an honor to meet you." The formality of the salute, the use of Robert's military rank, and the obvious sincerity in the young officer's voice created a moment of perfect clarity. Robert, still holding the flag, returned the salute with practiced precision. For a brief moment, the courtroom became a bridge between civilian and military life, between those who serve in uniform and those who serve in other ways. The elderly woman in the front row was openly weeping now, reminded of her late husband and the recognition he had deserved but rarely received. Michael Chun found himself thinking about his own relationship with authority and rules, wondering if he'd been missing opportunities to show compassion in his legal practice. Judge Williams watched this exchange between Robert and Officer Brooks with profound satisfaction. This was why she'd become a judge, not just to enforce laws, but to ensure that justice included mercy, understanding, and human decency. She'd seen too many cases where rigid adherence to procedure had trampled on basic human dignity. As the two men finished their salute and lowered their hands, Judge Williams made another unprecedented decision. She addressed the entire courtroom, speaking to everyone present rather than just the parties involved in the case. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "what we've witnessed here today is more important than any case I could rule on. We've seen what happens when we choose to look beyond surface appearances, when we take time to understand each other's stories, and when we have the courage to admit our mistakes and make them right. She turned back to Robert, who was still holding the flag and seemed overwhelmed by the attention. Mr. Martinez, regarding your case today, the broken taillight violation, I'm dismissing all charges. Furthermore, I'm directing Officer Brooks to assist you in getting your vehicle repaired through the court's community service fund. Robert's mouth opened in surprise. He'd come prepared to pay the fine, despite the financial hardship it would cause. This unexpected kindness felt like a gift he didn't deserve, though everyone else in the room knew he deserved it, and much more. Officer Brooks nodded immediately at Judge Williams's directive, already mentally calculating how to expedite the repair process for Robert's vehicle. More than that, he was thinking about how this encounter would change his approach to law enforcement. Rules were important, but understanding the people behind the circumstances was equally crucial. Your Honor, Robert said quietly, his voice still thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you for this kindness. I've been worried about the fine, about how I'd manage it on my pension. He paused, looking around the courtroom at faces that had transformed from indifferent strangers to engaged, caring human beings. But more than the money, what you've given me today is something I haven't felt in a long time: respect and recognition. Judge Williams smiled warmly. Mr. Martinez, you've given us far more than we've given you. You've reminded everyone in this room about the true meaning of service and sacrifice. She gestured to the people in the gallery. I suspect many of these folks will leave here today with a renewed appreciation for veterans and a better understanding of the costs of freedom. As if to prove her point, the elderly woman in the front row stood up and began to applaud. Her clapping was soon joined by Michael Chun, then by other observers throughout the courtroom. Even the court clerk and bailiff joined in, creating a sustained round of applause that seemed to go on forever. Robert stood holding the flag, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by this outpouring of respect and gratitude. When the applause finally died down, Officer Brooks approached Robert with something approaching reverence. Sergeant Martinez, I meant what I said about helping with your vehicle, but I'd also like to ask for something else if you're willing. Brooks paused, gathering his courage. Would you be willing to speak to our department's community outreach program? I think other officers could benefit from hearing your story, learning about the experiences of veterans in our community. Robert considered this request seriously. Public speaking had never been his strength, and sharing his experiences was often painful. But if it could help bridge the gap between veterans and law enforcement, if it could prevent other veterans from facing unnecessary confrontation or misunderstanding, perhaps it was worth stepping outside his comfort zone. Officer Brooks, Robert replied, if you think it might help, I'd be willing to share my experiences. Veterans sometimes have a hard time readjusting to civilian life, and law enforcement officers are often the first people we encounter when things go wrong. Better understanding on both sides could make a real difference. Judge Williams overheard this exchange and felt inspired to make one more gesture. Mr. Martinez, Officer Brooks, I'd like to extend that invitation to our court staff as well. We see veterans in here regularly, sometimes as defendants, sometimes as victims, sometimes as witnesses. Understanding your perspective could help us serve everyone more effectively. Word of what had happened in courtroom 3B spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the time Robert left the building, clutching his flag and wearing his cap with renewed pride, several other court employees had stopped him to shake his hand and thank him for his service. The janitor, a Vietnam veteran himself, gripped Robert's shoulder and simply said, "Welcome home, brother," words that carried more weight than any formal ceremony. Outside the courthouse, Officer Brooks walked with Robert to his pickup truck, noting the military stickers on the rear window and the small dent in the tailgate that probably had its own story. "Sergeant Martinez," he said as they reached the vehicle, "I want you to know that today changed something for me. I've been a cop for 8 years, and I thought I understood what serving meant. But watching you, listening to your story, seeing the way you carried yourself, even when you were being treated unfairly, that's taught me something about real service. Robert unlocked his truck and carefully placed the flag on the passenger seat where Rex usually rode. The old German Shepherd would be curious about the flag's scent, probably detecting the courthouse smells, and wondering about his master's adventure. "Officer Brooks," Robert said, turning back to the young policeman, "service comes in many forms. What you do, protecting the community, upholding the law, that's service too. Today you learned something, but you also taught me something." "What's that, sir?" "That good people can make mistakes, but what matters is what they do when they realize they've made them." You could have stood by your original position, defended your actions, argued with the judge. Instead, you listened, learned, and chose to do better. That takes character, and character is what real service is built on. 6 months later, Officer Brooks would often think back to that day in courtroom 3B when considering how to handle difficult situations. He'd learned to look beyond surface appearances, to consider the stories people carried with them, and to remember that behind every rule was a human being deserving of dignity and respect. Judge Williams kept a photo on her desk from the ceremony where Robert finally received proper recognition for his service from the local Veterans Affairs office. In the picture, Robert wore his faded military cap with pride, standing next to Officer Brooks and several other law enforcement officers who had become advocates for veteran services in their community. Robert Martinez never forgot that day in court, not because of the dismissed charges or the repaired taillight, but because of the moment when a room full of strangers chose to see him not as a problem to be managed, but as a hero to be honored. The flag Judge Williams gave him was displayed proudly in his small apartment, next to a photo of his unit in Afghanistan and Rex's favorite sleeping spot. The story of what happened in courtroom 3B became something of a legend in the courthouse, told and retold to new employees as an example of how justice and compassion could work together. But for those who were there that day, it remained much more than a story. It was a reminder that in a world often divided by misunderstanding and rigid thinking, moments of genuine human connection could still bridge any gap.